Just a few months ago, I asked the question, is the M2 Aleste Collection worth the price? Being a huge compile nut myself, I felt it was my duty to talk about how awesome the original Aleste games were. And while I could only guess what kind of a package M2 would put together, I created an in-depth video with tons of gameplay and my views on what made the originals a must-play. And because I already have all that great footage of the original games from my last video, I can now show you side by side how incredible these new ports look and play, in addition to all the features that M2 packed into each one. And now that the M2 Aleste Collection is finally out, it's on like Donkey Kong. Day one, I posted a long play of their brand new game, GG Aleste 3, and it is freaking outstanding. Now that I've got my hands on the entire collection, I had to put together a full review on the amazing job that M2 did. Not only is this one of the most feature-filled releases that M2 has done yet, but the games have never, ever looked this good. Heck, they've never even played this good. So let's start off with the brand new game that you've been waiting for, that I've been waiting for, developed by a dream team of former compile and rising staff. Game Gear Aleste 3, go! And speaking of dream teams, M2 brought in some legends for this game. Kazuyuki Nakashima from former Compile and Rising, who worked on the original GG Aleste, Blazing Lasers, Spriggan, Sokyugo Rentai, and Battle Garega, along with Shinsuke Yamakawa, an artist for both Battle Garega and Musha Aleste on the Mega Drive. And it doesn't stop there, as they also brought in Takahashi Yamashita, one of the lead programmers on Super Star Soldier from the PC Engine. And to top it off, the legendary Manabu Namiki to compose the music. With a biography so long, I wouldn't know where to start. Some of his many dozens of credits include Battle Garega, Armed Police Batrider, Mushi Futari, and many of the Dodonpachi games. After those name drops, do I even need to go into how good this game is? Clearly, M2 was serious about making one kick-ass shooter. And boy did they deliver. I honestly don't know how this game could run on an actual Game Gear, as aside from the slightly lower resolution, it looks every bit as good as many 16-bit shooters of the time. The effects that they pulled off across multiple stages needs to be played to be appreciated. M2 has pushed the Game Gear hardware far beyond what anyone would have thought possible. I never owned a Game Gear growing up, so when I finally played the old original GG Aleste games this year, I was a bit underwhelmed. They looked impressive for a handheld, and they had some cool music, but the hardware really struggled to perform. The original was plagued with slowdown, and while the second made vast improvements, it still paled in comparison to the amazing Master System games, which were some of my favorite from Compile's library. They did a lot with the hardware, but you can tell it was a struggle. Game Gear Aleste 3 has no such issues, even though it's designed to run on a real Game Gear. What slowdown and flicker it does have is pretty appropriate for the action that's happening on the screen, and now can be completely turned off in the options menu. So if you're looking for a zero slowdown, modern experience, you can have it all. But what struck me most about GG3 is the creativity, both in the stage designs and variety of enemies. It's constantly changing things up with each level, having very distinct areas. You can tell the designers really went to town on coming up with cool gimmicks. throughout every single stage. The very first stage has a bit of that Nexer and Rayforce feel, with you taking down large enemy cruisers on your way to an impressive looking opening boss. But it only gets better from there. Check out the opening of Wave 2 with all the birds flying off in the background, before later paying homage to the opening stage of the original and an impressive lead up to the boss with a cool stereo effect as it rips through the concrete, leaving only debris in its wake. You can actually hear the slash pan from right to left, then left to right. Did the Game Gear have stereo sound? Each stage and boss shows that kind of creativity with interesting mini-bosses, followed up by a stage boss with multiple phases and fun and unique ways of attacking you. This stage 4 boss fires off bubbles that hamper your ability to move and fire your weapon, but to the contrary, them slowing you down helps you maneuver through this tight wave of bullets. A particularly impressive Wave 5 with the rotating centrifuge not just being a background gimmick, but has you playing in an actual cylinder with the physics to match. It almost reminds me of the later stages of Airbuster, only implemented better here, to where your ship is affected by the inertia as you spin around the giant tube, chasing down the enemy ships and then speeding away from their fire. Then, the stage boss starts off the proceedings by stealing your power-ups and forcing you to begin the fight with nothing but your pea shooter until you can hit the next phase and gain it back. The later waves have you flying alongside motherships a la Image Fight, before taking the battle over the mothership itself and disabling it section by section. Yet another massively creative level that completely outshines anything from the previous Game Gear games. The final stage opens with you warping through a Stargate and into a high-speed battle with alien cruisers, taking them out as you warp past them. It's followed by a barrage of bullets and plenty of opportunity to get your dodge on before coming upon the end boss. I won't completely give away the ending here, and you can check out my full long play if you want to see it, but it's a hell of a finale with a 3-phase encounter and multiple sub-phases in its final form. While all of this mayhem does induce plenty of Game Gear slowdown and sprite flicker, as it was made to work on an actual portable, most will find it necessary to make it through the stage with all the bullets flying around. And for those capable of playing it at full speed, it's easily turned on in the options menu. If you haven't noticed, the music and sound design is outstanding, with plenty of memorable tracks and sound effects that capture the original sound of the Game Gear. Many of the old school compile sound effects are also used that'll bring back plenty of nostalgia. One of my favorite tracks is during the inertia battle of Wave 5, as it perfectly captures those timeless earworms of the PC Engine shooters, where instead of hard, raw sounding and metal tracks of later STGs, you have these fantastic upbeat melodies that perfectly capture the elation of the moment. GG3 is a top-tier shooting experience by any measure. It's a must-play, must-own game, made all the more impressive by the fact it was programmed to run on an actual Game Gear, not simply to look and sound like one. I've heard rumors of an actual Game Gear cart release, and not just it being a promo, so fingers crossed that happens too. It would also be amazing if after some time, M2 saw fit to release the game on its own, for those that didn't manage or could afford to spring for the entire collection. It's an absolute masterpiece of a game, and deserves to be played by every fan of old school shooting games. And if that weren't enough, it comes with the usual suite of options provided by M2 shot triggers, like detailed control of all your screen widgets, and the ability to adjust each one, or turn them on and off. Save and load states to practice any area to your heart's content. On the screen page, you can also change the background, the aspect ratio, and even play within a Game Gear screen, similar to what M2 did with the Turbo Express on the Mini. You can even tweak the size of your image in both height and width. You also have a scanline feature for all the games, with a few different intensities, and it really looks quite good here, without changing the actual color or look of the game. The suite of screen options is impressive all around. And of course, an awesome replay feature for every single game in the collection. Not your replays, all replays. Want to see how the top player cleared the game, or a certain stage or a boss? Download their replay from the ranking screen and watch it in the replay theater, hidden inside the materials section. How cool is that? And one of my favorite features, a more difficult but awesome no slowdown mode, where you can play at full speed and without any sprite flicker, which makes for some really intense sections in the game. There's also a hard mode titled Special Mode, which changes up the bullets fired and speed quite a bit, as well as introducing suicide shots to many of the destroyed enemies. Played on no slowdown mode, it's an assault on the senses and an absolute treat for anyone mad enough to complete it that way. Speaking of which, our friend WLTR3565 has already posted his playthrough in Special Mode without slowdown, which you can check out via link in my description. But here's a taste of some of that killer gameplay. Alright, so you're sold. You're ready to play Game Gear Aleste 3 right now. You wants it. You needs it. But $50 for the digital download and $70 for the basic physical, not counting shipping? That's a steep price to pay. So you're wondering, what else do I get for plunking down my hard-earned dollars? Well, I'm glad you asked, because GG3 is just the beginning of a stellar collection that blew me away with how great the games played. Like I said before, these aren't just good ports of the originals, they're better. And now I'm going to show you, side by side compared to my original gameplay, how much better they are to play, making them the definitive versions of these already excellent games. The collection opens up with a cool intro screen accompanied by an excellent tune that immediately has you wanting to jump in and start exploring. The GUI shows all the games included in the collection, 5 in total, the original Aleste and Power Strike 2 games from the Sega Master System, as well as the original Game Gear Aleste games along with the new GG3. Once you select a game, it gives you an option to pick which version you want to play. So in the case of the original, you can choose between the Japanese Aleste and international Power Strike version. And if you watched my pre-release video about this M2 Aleste collection, you've already heard me wax poetic about how much I absolutely love the original Aleste game. Of all the Aleste games ever released on a console, it is to me the most pure, unadulterated, balls-to-the-wall shmupgasm. It kicks your ass right from the opening moments, throwing waves of enemies at you before you've even had a chance to power up. Aleste makes you earn those stripes, but once you get good enough to make it through that opening onslaught and power up your ship, it becomes some of the most fun that I've had dodging bullets. And you'll be dodging them non-stop, without much of a break in the action, for the duration of the game. It absolutely never lets up, and the only breaks you get are the short pause between taking down a mid-stage boss before the screen starts scrolling again, and it's back into the fire. Because of that relentless pace, I really enjoy the rhythm that I get into playing Aleste. and I love the cool chip tunes in most of the stages, so I just turn up the music and it becomes easy to fall into the zone, or what's often called the flow state by many in the Shmup community, where everything else around you falls away and you become one with the game. Very few games do that for me, like Aleste. If you want to know even more about the full game itself, check out my in-depth preview. What I want to focus on here is how these amazing M2 ports are improved in just about every measurable way. The thing about Aleste is no matter how you slice it, it was an early game on hardware of limited power, and it shows, with the slowdown and sprite flicker starting to get pretty bad as the game gets hectic. And with Aleste, it's almost always hectic. And M2 reproduces the slowdown faithfully. You can see here with the two side by side how both are near identical. And to be honest, it's probably a good thing for how nuts Aleste can get. Of course, they included the no slowdown option for the idiots that would want to try playing it that way, but the original always felt right, and so does this new port. Of course, you know I'm just that kind of idiot, and had to try it at full speed, and well, it was a valiant effort. I'll be back for more punishment soon enough, but let's get back to this review. I also went ahead and measured the input delay playing on Aleste, and it's a blazing 2 frames. And that's including the 10 milliseconds of delay on my monitor. The more graphically demanding Game Gear Aleste 3 was just a frame slower at 3 frames. Both incredible performers and what I'd expect from an M2 Shot Triggers release. I was, however, made aware of an audio delay in the game and tried to use my editing software to gauge the amount. From what I could tell, at least on GG3, it was about 1/10 of a second, or 6 frames. Given how fast the input response is, at only 2 to 3, it's hard to imagine it being a performance issue. Of any genre, audio delay is the least noticeable in shmups, and both myself and other more expert players on my Discord never noticed during the gameplay, even after completing it every which way. We aren't playing Rocksmith here, but I did want to note it as it's something to explore, or maybe even inquire about from M2, to see if it had a purpose. You may have also noticed how bright and colorful the game looks. I was worried that the older, low-resolution graphics would look like a mess on the Switch, on a modern TV, and my worries were unfounded. I've never seen any of the Aleste games look this good. On the sound front, it's hard to perfectly mimic that original Sega Master System FM sound, but as usual, M2 did a pretty bang-up job. Check out this track playing side by side between the original and M2 port. Not bad, right? And to top it off, the options menu lets you select both the FM music or the original BGM, depending on your preference. It's a feature that I expected M2 to include, and I'm glad to say they did just that. Speaking of options, you sure get a whole lot of them. As expected here, the no slowdown mode is here as well, and in every one of the games, in case you want to make this already bullet-ridden game even more difficult. However, they've also included a really cool easy mode that adjusts factors within the game to make it more approachable for beginners. When you die, your ship will not power down to its most basic state, as well as your weapon power level remains the same when you switch out to a different number. In Aleste, picking up an item gives you temporary invincibility, which is now longer in duration. And the weapon power-ups in general appear more frequently. All of these combine to make it a more manageable experience for players new to the game. On the topic of rank, the Aleste games were some of the very first to implement that kind of a system with Zanac AI, where it dynamically adjusted the difficulty based on your ship's power level, how many enemies you've shot down, and a number of other factors that may still remain a mystery to anyone aside from the original programmers. The options menu allows you to turn that feature on and off, and you can now see your rank in the always useful M2 widgets on the sidebar. Note that changing various options also changes which leaderboard your achievements go, either a default leaderboard for the standard game settings or a mix if you change things up like the AI mode or some of the other features, and it will change to say out of scope if you enable easy features or use load states for practice. M2 really thought through everything in putting together the leaderboards for the competitive community to enjoy. And of course, an awesome replay feature for every single game in the collection. Not your replays, all replays. Want to see how the top player cleared the game, or a certain stage, or a boss? Download their replay from the ranking screen and watch it in the replay theater, hidden inside the materials section. How cool is that? They've even added a gallery mode for Aleste art from various games, along with a sound test and controller configuration. Aleste may not be everyone's cup of tea. It released in 1988 after all, so the stages are simple and the graphics repetitive. And the bosses are all variations of bullet-spewing turrets to destroy. It's devoid of flash and gimmicks, and is very much the spiritual successor to Zanac, but it gets the purity of the shooting experience just right, and focuses on the depth and variety of ways that you can play. It has a ton of weapon options, a staple of compile shooters, so whether you prefer using weapons to cancel bullets in typical compile fashion to make things easier, or getting your dodge on and seeing how long you can last, Aleste has a ton of gameplay depth where it counts. Once you remove all the flash, you're left with a pure shooting experience, played to some cool music, so it's one I always enjoy coming back to, and M2 has made it the definitive version to play. Everything that I've said so far about Aleste also holds true for the next release, Power Strike 2. This is a big one, and a reason a lot of folks are picking up this collection. Not only is Power Strike 2 considered the best exclusive shooting game on the Master System, but it's also extremely rare, having only ever released in the Europe PAL regions, as well as Brazil. The original game sells on the used market for over $500, and to top it off, it only plays correctly on a PAL console. Otherwise, you get sped up gameplay and music on an NTSC system. It was a very late Master System release, past the end of its life in 1993, so Compile had a serious mastery of the hardware by then, and while it's part of a different timeline from the Aleste series, it very much looks, feels, and plays like one. However, the stages are now more elaborate and varied, and the bosses especially are something to behold. Massive, multi-segmented machines that take up most of the screen and need to be dismantled in sections. It took up so many resources from the console that the battles are normally fought on plain or non-existent backgrounds so they can make them as impressive as possible. Power Strike 2 now plays like a dream, at the correct speed and pace, fixed by M2 as if it were an official NTSC release, both the speed of the game and the music. The options are also very similar, along with some added game-specific settings. Power Strike 2 added a Super Burst feature, where holding down the base fire button would charge up a burst attack. The longer held, the longer its eventual duration when unleashed, and you can adjust how it functions in the menu. Another unique feature to this game is a debug mode from the original, now easily turned on from the menu. It restarts the game, and the in-game options now provide all kinds of cool new features like a stage select, your ship speed, rank setting, a boss test mode, and even a death or no death mode to just play through. You can even just watch the game's ending from here. It's a debug menu I never knew about in the original, so it's really cool to see here. When you start each game, you get a display of the game manual showing you all you need to know on how to play. All of the manuals are also accessible from the main GUI screen, and although it's only in Japanese, a quick camera shot and a Google Translate gave me all the info I needed to know. If the original Aleste is a bit too Spartan and repetitive, and you prefer the flash and creativity of a newer release, Power Strike 2 is an excellent game by every measure. It's got the graphics chops, good sound, great gameplay with almost no slowdown, even by default, and is the best exclusive shooter the Master System had. With its rarity and complexity to play at the proper speed, this version is again the definitive way to play. Both Aleste and Power Strike 2 are old compile favorites of mine, but how about the original Game Gear games? I mentioned earlier how playing the new GG3 really made the originals show their age, especially in the gameplay department. Well, I'm happy to report that these new revamped ports on the M2 Collection were a breath of fresh air, and how I wished I'd played them in the first place. Playing an old Game Gear game emulated and blown up on a modern monitor is certainly not the prettiest sight. The graphics were meant for a small, low-resolution Game Gear screen, so emulating it on my PC monitor didn't look so hot. Though M2 really pulled some magic, as they now look fantastic on my much larger 55-inch monitor. As I said before, these games have never, ever looked so good, and it was suddenly a pleasure to play through them again. And not just for the graphics alone. My biggest complaint with the original GG Aleste especially was the massive slowdown when things got hectic, to the point where it made the game feel way too easy and not nearly all that fun. It had some really cool designs, a very memorable final boss, along with some excellent music, but it couldn't compare to my experience with the Master System games. Now with M2's fixes, both games run as they should with purposeful slowdown that feels just right for the hardware. What was once an exercise in excruciating slowdown that gave me Super R-Type flashbacks on the SNES now made the game fun to play, and to top it off, the same complete no slowdown option exists for both games as well. Since I had already played through it on normal using an emulator, I decided to go with the special mode for the M2 release, and even with the suicide bullets and increasingly crowded screen, you can clearly tell the slowdown here is quite a bit different from the original. It makes the game a lot more fun and challenging on the harder setting. The Game Gear games are definitely a different beast from the Master System. The levels are creative and varied, and not nearly as repetitive, a product of a later time in the history of STGs. They're also much more mainstream in their presentation and difficulty, making them accessible for less experienced players. GG Aleste 2 upped the ante with some seriously cool stage designs, more varied graphics, and something much closer to the new GG3. Again, if you want a much more in-depth look at these games, check out my primer video where I show a lot more gameplay and talk about both of these Game Gear games in detail. If these were simply the original ports as I played them emulated, I'd say your mileage may vary. Worth it if you have a big nostalgia for them, but to temper your expectations otherwise. With these shiny new M2 ports, I can wholeheartedly say that any fan of Aleste and Compile should play and enjoy them. M2 took my two main complaints, the low-res ugly graphics of playing them on a monitor and the excessive slowdown, and provided a modern way to enjoy them with those aspects fixed. Playing them on this collection was a far better experience than when I first did, emulated using my PC. Sure, I could have tried them on a Game Gear, but given how limited that hardware was, I don't expect they would have come close to the majesty these spanking new ports are. But wait, there's more. Once I had checked out all the new ports and what they had to offer, I then took a deep dive into the new challenge menu. And I have to say, of all the new additions M2 has done, especially with the GUI and options, this new mode blew me away the most. M2 has been outdoing themselves ever since their fantastic GUI on the PC Engine Mini. And now, they've done it again here with a layout so cool, it just makes you want to try every stage, section, and boss of every game. It looks beautiful, is easy to see, and is perfect for competition and the leaderboards. Every game has its own page, with each stage and level boss graphically represented. You can choose to play just the level, just the boss, the entire stage, or the entire game. You can even choose bonus stages not easily accessible directly from the game, and every challenge can be played over and over for score and a spot in the rankings. But it goes further. This challenge mode is also a really great way for novice players to practice and enjoy the full game, as it incorporates a slickly integrated rewind feature. Instead of constantly saving and loading states throughout a level, it will automatically just rewind your gameplay a few seconds every time you die, and it'll just let you keep playing and playing, rewinding every time until you clear the level. Of course, you won't get into the rankings that way, but for someone just getting started or wanting to learn, it makes playing through the levels much less of a chore compared to saving and loading your game. In fact, it was a perfect way for me to also play around with various difficulty settings and see how well I could do, or not do, on the highest modes, getting a shot to keep retrying ridiculously difficult stages and settings to see if they were fun, or just impossible. What's not to like? The package is so amazing, I can really only think of one thing. I would have loved to also see a port of the MSX exclusive Aleste 2. It takes everything that I enjoy about the original and amps up the graphics, stage designs, story, and difficulty. I'm currently working on a Shmups on Mr. video, and this gameplay and footage is from my early recordings. Aside from the fantastic Aleste 2, which would have been great, Aleste Gaiden, also an MSX exclusive, is an incredibly fun, ground-based shooter similar to Undead Line. So as long as I'm doling out wish lists, that's another one I would have loved to see. People will say, oh, they should have included Musha Aleste and Super Aleste, but honestly, now that I've spent time with this collection, they don't really fit. They're very different games released at a very different time. The M2 Aleste Collection is an homage to the compile of old, their 8-bit classics that started it all, along with a brand new game in the same style that pays homage to them. Currently, M2 is supposedly working on a brand new, more modern Aleste branch that would seem the right time and place to possibly release as part of a modern compile package with the games I just mentioned, along with Xanac Neo from the PS1. You can make the argument that $70 isn't cheap, nor $50 for just a download, but as far as I'm concerned, that argument is way off base when it's a package of this quality. Think about all the incredible developers M2 had to bring back to make GG3 possible, all the labor hours of improving the originals so much, and creating such an impressive Switch port. Do you really think something like that can happen at this level of quality and only sell for $20 or $30 like shmups you see on Steam? I don't think so. In fact, it's a sad state of affairs when our own shmup community is to blame for the difficulty the genre has had for so long. We keep asking for great new games and ports, and yet we aren't willing to pay proper game prices. We're spoiled by Steam sales for $10 and $20, which completely devalue the work of indie developers. I'm shocked that an amazing game like Crimson Clover is only 20 bucks. That is a top tier game that would have and still should sell for $50 to $60. Do you really think the best and brightest will continue to make these great games for pennies on the dollar? Do you really think M2 will continue to make amazing games like Game Gear Aleste 3 as part of these packages when people bitch and complain that it costs too much? No, they'll just stop making them, and we will all be the poorer for it. Talent deserves to be recognized. Hard work deserves to be properly compensated. I would much rather pay 50 bucks for an amazing product like this than 20 bucks for a lazy, bare minimum port like we see more often these days. So if you think these games look awesome and this work by M2 looks sweet, put your money where your mouth is and support it. Or if not, support other great new games that you've been wanting, especially at the bargain basement prices most go for now. You've watched my review. You know what I think. If you're a fan of these older compile games, this collection is not to be missed. In fact, I had so much fun with the new GG3, I'd pay full pop for the game alone, and the rest of the collection is the icing on the cake. If you're at all interested, let alone a fan of the games, support the incredible talent that makes them for us. If you, like me, want this shmup renaissance to continue and be a part of it, support great products and the developers behind them. It's an investment in the future of a wonderful genre that deserves a second coming. And if there's any developer that deserves our support, it's definitely M2 and the awesome work that they're doing. If you want to know much more about the cool games on this collection, don't forget that you can check out my in-depth preview of all these games in my previous video. Or if you want to check out other videos of newly released excellent indie games, you can do that right here. For those who already bought the collection and are enjoying the heck out of the new Game Gear Aleste 3, like I am, then go ahead and smoke them, because you already got them.